When I turned 18, my parents told me to leave home. Now, at 30, I find myself without a place to live. My parents lost all their money, and I'm left on the streets. They never really wanted me. I was just an unexpected addition to their lives. When I was young, life was good, but things changed as I got older. My parents seemed less interested in spending time with me once I wasn't so cute anymore. They were always busy with their business, which was like their whole world. I didn't have any other family nearby, so TV and my teachers were like my family. Even on my birthdays, I often felt alone because my parents were too busy to celebrate with me. They just gave me money to buy whatever I wanted. Christmas and back-to-school shopping were pretty much the same story. We barely had a Christmas tree after I turned 10, but I managed to persuade my parents to get a fake one that I could set up and take down each year. If I had to paint a picture of my parents, they'd be the type who dress in black, enjoy their wine, and have a snobby attitude. The last time I saw them, they hadn't changed much, except my dad had started wearing a toupee. When I turned 16, I asked my parents if I could work part-time at their business, but they said there were no openings. It felt like they didn't want me there. Then, when I turned 18, they expected me to leave home since I was an adult. I was still in high school and working part-time, barely saving for college. Soon after graduation, they gave me an eviction notice and didn't help me move out. I had to rely on a friend's dad for help. I ended up in a rundown apartment, working in retail with no time or experience for college. Just a few months later, I got fired from my job because my manager seemed to have a grudge against me and kept writing me up for trivial reasons. I can't even recall what they were anymore. But I wasn't the only one treated unfairly. I reported the manager to corporate along with others who had similar experiences. Corporate investigated and eventually fired the manager for various reasons, although they kept most of it under wraps. I heard rumors about cigarette theft being one of the reasons, considering the manager was a heavy smoker. Despite corporate's actions, they refused to rehire me, only changing my termination to a layoff on paper to keep my reason clean. It seemed like they didn't want to give me another chance. I quickly ran out of money due to poor financial management and struggled to find steady work, leading to losing my apartment. Desperate, I turned to my parents for help, but they turned me away, leaving me homeless and forced to live in a tent during the winter in someone's backyard. My friends had moved on to college, leaving me behind as a broke kid doing whatever odd jobs I could find to survive. My luck changed when a neighbor of my parents discovered I was living in a tent and offered me shelter to avoid freezing. With her support, I pressured my parents into revealing how to contact my other relatives, although they were reluctant, likely ashamed of how they treated me. Despite their warning not to bother them again, they reluctantly provided me with a list of contact information. I reached out to my paternal grandparents, whom I hadn't seen since I was a baby, and they were overjoyed to hear from me, welcoming me with open arms when they learned of my situation. They immediately flew me over to live with them, essentially adopting me as their own. My parents didn't even bother to see me off at the airport, despite being invited. For nearly a decade, I had no communication with them. My grandparents, upon learning of my parents' mistreatment of me, disowned them legally, removing them from their wills. Although my parents claimed they didn't need anything from my grandparents, their financial situation eventually proved otherwise. After living with my grandparents for about a year, I saved up enough to attend community college. With their support, I earned an associate's degree and landed a good job, thanks to my grandpa's recommendation. Eventually, my grandparents decided to sell me their house so they could retire to Arizona. My grandma's health was suffering in the cold winters, and they wanted to move somewhere warmer. While I was sad to see them leave, I gladly bought the house from them at a third of its value. I'll have it paid off in a few years. My job requires me to travel frequently, keeping me away from home for weeks at a time, but I enjoy the adventure. Right now, I don't have any pets or a girlfriend. I'm focused on my career. However, I hope to find companionship in the future once I have some stability. I don't want to remain a solitary bachelor forever. Returning home after more than 2 weeks away in late 2020, I was startled to find an unfamiliar white van parked in my driveway. Concerned, I was about to contact the authorities when I noticed my parents' business logo on the side of the van, filling me with dread. To my disbelief, my parents had broken into my house and were making themselves at home. Despite my anger, they greeted me casually, as if nothing was wrong. I demanded they leave immediately, but they refused, arguing that it was my grandparents' house. I reminded them that they had sold it to me upon retiring, a fact they would have known had they been involved in my life. However, they persisted, claiming it was their right to stay as it was originally their parents' house. Frustrated, I retreated to my bedroom, locking the door, and called the police. When the police arrived, they were unable to resolve the situation. My parents falsely claimed they had established residency, despite having just arrived, and asserted squatters' rights, lacking evidence to the contrary, and with no surveillance footage or support from neighbors, I found myself in a stalemate. My parents even fabricated a story of a verbal rental agreement with me, and my mother resorted to tears to sway the officers. The police deemed it a family dispute and advised me to pursue legal eviction through the courts, which was complicated by delays due to the pandemic in 2020. Meanwhile, my parents remained in my home without paying rent, flaunting their victory over me. They confessed that their business had collapsed, forcing them to liquidate most of their assets to settle debts. With nothing left but their van and personal belongings, they saw my home as their lifeline for the foreseeable future. Both of my parents managed to secure new jobs after moving in. My father became a delivery driver, while my mother found work as a sales associate. While they were earning, their only contribution was towards the electricity and water bills, which essentially amounted to handing me $100 each month, accompanied by reminders of their generosity. Whenever I broached the subject of proper rent, they dismissed it, arguing that I owed them for the 18 years they spent raising me, despite not requesting reimbursement for that time. They even threatened to withdraw assistance with the utilities altogether if I persisted. Frustrated, I reached out to my grandparents to explain the situation. Though they were displeased, my parents remained adamant, asserting their right to stay in my home. My grandfather expressed regret, acknowledging that had they not sold me the house, my parents wouldn't have taken advantage of the situation. However, I reassured him that I had already initiated legal proceedings for eviction, and my parents were well aware that their stay was temporary. I made sure my parents overheard my determination as I relayed this to my grandparents. Their response was silence. My father, occupied with his delivery job 6 days a week, often kept his distance, clearly discontent with the work. Meanwhile, my mother attempted to assert control over my home during her free time. She insisted on rearranging my living room and even pushed for my parents to claim the master bedroom, arguing they deserved it as my parents. I rejected both demands, asserting that they were not entitled to special treatment and emphasizing that I did not owe them anything simply for raising me, a basic parental duty. It was evident they were trying to assert dominance to prevent eviction. After 4 months, in early 2021, I resorted to legal action against my parents for squatting. Despite their resistance and attempts at manipulation, claiming former ownership by my grandparents and citing their $100 monthly contribution, the lack of a formal rental agreement worked in my favor. Recognizing their futile attempts, the judge ordered their eviction within 30 days. They had no rightful claim to my house. After the court ruling, they confronted me, expressing disappointment for evicting their own flesh and blood. I couldn't help but laugh, seeing the irony in their words, and labeled them as hypocrites for their previous actions toward me. Their lack of concern for my well-being spoke volumes about their supposed parental love. I owed them nothing. They attempted to lay claim to everything that was mine, but their actions hardly reflected those of loving parents. I confronted them, calling them out as snobby, deceitful narcissists, and warned them to prepare for their departure, as I wouldn't hesitate to involve the authorities if necessary. My father's anger was palpable, but my mother intervened, preventing any further escalation. With sneers and tension thick in the air, they eventually left. The final month was fraught with attempts to guilt me or ignore me altogether. I marked each passing day on a calendar in the living room, eagerly anticipating their departure date, which I circled in red. I vividly recall the relief of March 2nd, the day they were finally gone. On the very day they were legally obligated to vacate my home, my parents stubbornly remained, despite having removed all their belongings and even resorting to sleeping on the floor of the guest room in a futile attempt to persuade me to let them stay. They only began searching for an apartment after the court's eviction order was finalized. My mother struggled for weeks to secure a place, eventually settling for a small and subpar studio apartment in a neighboring city due to the limited options available on short notice. The situation bore a striking resemblance to my own experience at 18, adding an ironic twist to the ordeal. I drove my mother to see the apartment, and it was in dismal condition. The walls were an unappealing baby green, the carpet appeared decades old, and the sole window offered a view of a nearby brick wall. Lacking modern amenities, there was no dishwasher, and the stove was unusually small. The bathroom facilities were outdated, with the toilet clearly in need of replacement. The thin walls offered little privacy, as we could hear the loud arguments of neighbors in the adjoining unit. Despite my mother's attempts to evoke sympathy with sad looks and subtle hints about my apparent guilt, I feigned ignorance until she relented. They promptly signed the lease and relocated their meager belongings to the apartment over the weekend. They insisted on taking the queen-size bed, dresser, and flat-screen TV from my guest room, which they had occupied for 5 months. Fed up, I allowed them to take the items, eager to rid my house of reminders of their presence. Their reaction implied they felt slighted, but they left without further demands. As soon as they departed for good, I wasted no time changing the locks on all exterior doors. With all their belongings now in the apartment and their last night spent in my guest room, I began replacing the front door lock while they loaded their van. Their silent observation did little to disrupt my focus, and they left without a word once the new lock was in place. A wave of relief washed over me as their van disappeared down the road. I felt as though karma had finally caught up with them, and I was content to let them live with the consequences of their actions. However, recent communication from my grandparents suggested otherwise. They recently contacted my grandparents to boast about their new business venture, similar to their previous one, now operating in the same state where I reside. Apparently, they're rapidly regaining their former status, enjoying financial success, and indulging in their familiar snobbish lifestyle. I couldn't help but feel a surge of resentment. After subjecting me to homelessness and squatting in my home for months, they seamlessly returned to their privileged ways. Despite my hopes for karma to intervene, their swift resurgence leaves me questioning its existence. Update. Thanks everyone for your helpful advice. I'm starting to see the value in selling the house, especially after discussing it with my grandparents. They support the idea of me moving closer to them if I decide to sell. Moving away would also mean my parents won't be able to track me down easily, which is a big plus. I'm exploring the possibility of getting transferred to a southern location by my company, which I think I'd enjoy due to the warmer climate. Winter has never been my favorite season, especially after having to live in a tent before. Since I'm not deeply rooted where I currently live and don't have many close friends, starting fresh elsewhere doesn't seem too daunting. While I do have some sentimental attachment to this house, it's not like I grew up here, so I'm open to the idea of moving. I understand the importance of beefing up security with more cameras, and I'll be looking into that. Regarding how my parents managed to break in and deceive the police, it was shockingly straightforward. They found an unlocked window, grabbed my spare keys, and then fabricated a story about having a verbal agreement to live here. They even went as far as changing their address with the DMV online to make their claims more convincing. Unfortunately, the police didn't offer much help and just advised me to go through the eviction process. I regret not getting their badge numbers to report their negligence. Quick update. Yes, my parents redirected their mail to my house, adding another layer to their residency claim. If they stayed in my house for over 30 days with my supposed permission, squatters' rights could legally make them tenants. They manipulated the situation and used every tactic to convince the police they had the right to be there. With no clear evidence of how long they've been living in the house, It became a messy finger-pointing situation, leaving the police uncertain. This led me to pursue eviction through the courts. I did withhold the Wi-Fi password from my parents, since they weren't contributing to the utility bills. However, they found a workaround by using their smartphones as hotspots for internet access during their stay. As for suggestions about leaving negative reviews or exposing my parents' past, I've decided to take the high road and move on. However, if they're involved in fraudulent activities with their new business, I'll be watching with interest to see how it unfolds. Update 2. For those skeptical about the 30-day rule concerning squatters, here's the direct law in the USA. In many areas, if someone resides on your property for over 30 days with your consent, they can claim certain rights, legally becoming your tenants. This often requires following an eviction process. Even in cases where no permission was given, if an unoccupied property is unlawfully entered and lived in, specific rules still apply. My parents manipulated the situation by fabricating permission and misrepresenting their duration of stay in my house, prolonging the eviction process to 5 months. Now you have the facts. Update 3. 5 days later, after some investigation and discussions within the family, I've discovered some curious details about my parents' sudden resurgence into business after bankruptcy. Contrary to speculation, their venture isn't an NLM, even they wouldn't stoop to such tactics. Their new business is notably smaller than their previous one, employing only the two of them compared to their former staff. Concerns were raised about potential identity theft, prompting me to monitor my credit closely, a habit I'd already adopted since dealing with their squatting situation. While I wouldn't put anything past them, there's been no suspicious activity on my credit, indicating they haven't attempted to access company funds through me. My paternal grandparents, who genuinely care for me, remain puzzled about the source of my parents' newfound wealth. Despite their attempts to reach out, my parents' calls have been rebuffed since they boasted about their success. It's evident they received no support from my father's side of the family. What about my mother's side of the family? I remembered I had an old list of contacts from my parents, which included my maternal grandmother's landline number. When I was homeless, I tried reaching out to her, but she showed no interest. Although I've never met them in person, my maternal grandparents seem to share similarities with my parents. It's like my father truly found his match in my mother. As someone pointed out earlier, they seem made for each other. I managed to reconnect with my maternal grandmother only to learn that she's been divorced for a while now, and my maternal grandfather passed away 7 months ago, leaving a significant inheritance to my mother. So that's where the money for their new business came from. My maternal grandmother seemed proud of their success and didn't delve into much else during our conversation. It's likely why my parents boasted to her about their achievements, especially since my good grandparents had cut them off. However, I couldn't care less, and neither could my good grandparents. Everyone on my father's side of the family has distanced themselves from my parents. They want nothing to do with them. It's not just me they've alienated. My mother's side of the family is also fractured, filled with divorcees and loners who dislike each other but pretend to get along. In contrast, my father's side is more normal and kind-hearted. Unfortunately, my father tends to burn bridges repeatedly. Even when I was born, my grandparents wanted to be involved in my life, but my parents kept me away from them for some unknown reason. I'm not entirely sure why they did this, but I suspect it's because they didn't want to face judgment for their own parenting. I would have preferred if they had sent me to boarding school or to live with my grandparents. But I suppose narcissists need someone to belittle to feel satisfied. I can only imagine the things they said about me behind my back all these years. Nevertheless, it seems my parents didn't break any laws to start their new business. At least nothing reportable to the IRS. There's no law against using inheritance money to kickstart self-employment, and my mother inherited everything from her father, including his house and land, where my parents now live. It's not the fanciest place, but it's decent, comparable to my own home. This means my parents have a place to stay without bothering me anymore. I'm considering selling my house and relocating, but unfortunately, my current employer doesn't have a branch in Arizona. So my options are either to resign and seek employment in Arizona after selling my house, or to stay put and hope my parents don't bother me again. I'm actively searching for job opportunities because I'm determined not to let my parents find me ever again. If moving proves impossible, I'll invest in installing cameras both inside and outside my house for added security. While I doubt a similar situation will occur, I want to ensure my parents never try to track me down again for any reason. If they need assistance in their old age, I won't be there for them. They'll receive what they gave, nothing. They're dead to me, and the rest of my father's family feels the same way. If I ever have children or stepchildren, I'll make sure I never become like my parents. No child should endure what I did.